as we've just passed 6:30, I think it's a good move to start the lecture, or the talk rather. I don't think really he needs introduction to people here, but this is our speaker. This is Richard Williams, or Richard David Williams, as his book is the authored. So you're a cultural historian of music in South Asia, and your research brings music and sound studies into conversation with the study of religion and Indian cultural history. You're at SOAS, and just confirmed earlier, you're currently head of music at SOAS. So I'm not going to say any more than that, because I think what we want to hear is from Richard about this wonderful looking book that's come out relatively recently. So I'm going to hand over to you, Richard. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming, particularly on a pretty dark, wet evening. It's very kind of you to be here this evening. Yeah, I'd like, well, there are lots of people who have a relationship with the Royal Asiatic Society who really helped in this research, and it's really wonderful to be able to come here and share some thoughts about this book with you. Effectively, this text presents a new social history of how Hindustani art music evolved over the 19th century. And in particular, the book considers how musicians and music lovers in North India responded to the political transition from the Mughal Empire to British colonialism. There we go. Well, the central focus of the book are two courts, the courts of Wajid Ali Shah, the last ruler or Nawab of the North Indian kingdom of Awadh. And many of you will know the name Wajid Ali Shah. He was one of the most colorful and controversial characters of the 19th century, and he's had a very polarizing legacy. According to political histories, he was a failure of a king who was forced to surrender his kingdom to the East India Company on the eve of the Indian Uprising of 1857. But then on the other hand, if you talk to musicians and people interested in musical history, he's remembered either as a decadent aesthete or as a path-breaking genius. After the annexation of his kingdom in 1856, Wajid Ali Shah went into exile and migrated across India to Calcutta, where he set up a new court in exile at Matiyaburj, a suburb in the south of the city. The king, in fact, had a reputation for being chronically unwell. So at the time in 1856, the East India Company officials assumed that he wouldn't live for very long. And so to sort of soften the blow of the annexation, they gave him a very large pension. He surprised everyone by living for another 30 years. And so what happened in that time was the British increasingly panicked about how much money they were spending on him. But the side effect of that was they also monitored what he was spending it all on. And music and pigeons were a big part of that expenditure. And so when I was doing this research, part of my project was to reconstruct this court at Matiyaburj, and there was a lot of documentation involved, which allowed me to do work. So the book charts the movement of musicians and dancers between these courts, as well as the circulation of intellectual traditions and musical genres across regions from North India to Eastern India to Bengal. And the book talks about the importance of this 30-year exile period for the rise of Calcutta as a celebrated center of Hindustani classical music. In particular, since Lucknow is associated with late Mughal or Nawabi society and Calcutta with colonial Bengali modernity, looking at the relationship between the two cities sheds light on forms of continuity and transition as artists and their patrons navigated the political ruptures and social transformations of the 19th century. So one of the challenges of this work is that primarily we're looking at music before it was ever recorded. But to get us in the mood, I'm going to play a very short clip from Satyajit Ray's film, The Chess Players, Shatranj Ke Khilari, which many of you will know, of course. It's a masterpiece of Indian cinema, and it was extremely well researched. So I'm going to play a little fragment. The story here, as you know, depicts the decadent, although we'll come back to that word, decadent, fragile world of Wajid Ali Shah's Lucknow. And here I'm going to show you a scene where Wajid Ali Shah is watching a Nautch girl, so a dancing girl. For those of you who don't know, Nautch comes from the Hindi nach, meaning dance, and this was the staple entertainment for aristocrats in this period, and also indeed for British colonial officials who referred to it not as nach, but Nautch. So this is where the word Nautch girl comes from. Let's have a quick look. Finished there, but it's beautiful, beautiful sequence. As I began working on this topic, I was struck by how both in popular memory, but also in academic research on this period, there are three different storylines, and they don't necessarily gel together. So the first idea is that this movement from Lucknow to Calcutta was extremely significant. It was important for the cultivation of the art music scene in Calcutta, and it sort of it was a very important catalyst for what became North Indian classical music. But then there's a second storyline that the courtly world of Lucknow was killed off in 1856 and then in the uprising of 57. So according to that line of thinking, Wajid Ali Shah's court in exile had to be an undead monument to a bygone age. And in particular, this idea was promoted by an Urdu journalist, Abdul Halim Shara, who had in fact grown up in the court in exile in Matiyaburj, but really talked about this as a dead, gone world. And then finally, there's another narrative that this was the period when art music moved out of courts and into the public realm. So here there's the idea that with the consolidation of the British Empire and the demise of aristocratic patrons, we see the growth of new middle-class institutions and intellectuals, which became the gatekeepers of the performing arts. So as I began writing this book, I began to wonder, how did these storylines all go together? How, on the one hand, could Wajid Ali Shah's court be so influential if Lucknow had also expired and music had moved on from courtly patronage? So the usual solution is that when Wajid Ali Shah's star fell and crashed into Kolkata, the musicians who accompanied him emerged from the ruins of the court and entered a new regime of music, one shaped by the concerns of publics, markets, and nationalisms. But this wasn't particularly satisfying. Certainly, music did evolve in new directions in colonial India, and it was in this period that we see the growth of new institutions. So I'm talking about schools, concert halls, proscenium theatres that were all quite new and different at that time. We also see the rise of new technologies, including notation and gramophone recording. and indeed reformist agendas, which would revolve around questions about the nation, around women, around morality. But as I worked on this book, I began to suspect that this apparent transition from elite patronage to a commercialized market wasn't really so straightforward or smooth. And so when I began to look through sources in Hindi, Urdu, and Bengali, and then looked at these against English government files, legal documents, and newspapers, a much more complicated picture emerged, which made me question some of the assumptions we routinely rely on in histories of music and culture more broadly for colonial India. So where did these narratives about decline, rupture, and loss come from? In part, this reflects how music and the arts were entangled in larger conversations over the end of the 19th century as intellectuals grappled with the trauma and implications of political and social change. Following the devastating violence of 1857 and the final collapse of the Mughal Empire, the themes of loss and nostalgia unfolded across Urdu literature. And this comes through very powerfully in Ev Tignol's recent book on grief and the shaping of Muslim communities. And with time, the discourse on nostalgia expanded into new directions. So on the one hand, as CM9 showed some time ago, Muslim intellectuals began to connect the demise of the Mughals with a broader discussion about Islamic civilization and decline in history. On the other hand, my book traces how these themes also emerge in Bengali memoirs, when writers meditated on the image of the weeping Mughal musician to reflect on the end of an era. And we'll come back to that image of the weeping musician a bit later. A second explanation for this storyline about rupture and decline is about language and the language of scholarship and how ideas about cultural ownership changed over this period. So there was a long history of musicology in South Asia, going back to Sanskrit, Persian, and then classical Hindi intellectuals. And the world of musical thought changed dramatically in the 19th century, propelled by new language policies and academic registers. So this is a little complicated. So first of all, musicology in Persian and classical Hindi, Braj Bhasha, gets superseded. It gets taken over by books in modern forms of Urdu, Hindi, and Bengali. At the same time, while that's happening, the writers who are doing Hindi and Bengali often ignore or undermine the new work that's happening in Urdu. So there's a conflict in the musical literature. And some of these writers then also begin to talk about music in English, often talking to an imagined universal or at least European readership from outside the culture. And so all of these language changes had a knock-on effect where it generated new ideas about who was responsible for curating musical knowledge. And it led to a movement away from courtly intellectuals, away from scholars who were trained in Persian and Urdu, and of course the Muslim ustads, the Muslim master musicians. And in the book, I talk about how often when we do music history, we focus far too much on materials in English, which, as I've said, is one part of this larger multilingual constellation. And all of this has led to the impression of a dramatic sea change, the casting off of an older courtly imaginary. And while there is some basis in that, by examining a wider range of sources across languages, it's also possible to see continuities in thought and an evolving aesthetic rather than a complete rupture between a courtly past and a colonial modernity. And related to this is the theme of decadence. So kings and ascets like Wajid Ali Shah were routinely denounced as decadent in this period, while the trope of moral decay leading to the demise of the Mughal Empire and so on became pervasive in 19th century history writing. Contemporary writers would ruminate on the decline of the Ancien regime, while music reformers would insist that the musical arts needed saving from despotic patrons, corrupt and illiterate musicians, and lurid dancing girls. And all of this language fed into the idea that the modern city took over where the decadent court left off and gave a new platform for reformed music, one worthy of the nation and public interest. So my book joins in with a critique of the decadence trope, and it brings music into conversation with studies of Urdu poetry, European Orientalism, and British historiography. And in particular, I look at the figure of Wajid Ali Shah and how he became seen, in British sources at least, as this effeminate Oriental despot. And I offer alternative readings of his aesthetic based on what he actually wrote about himself. So just to give you an example of this wonderful image, so this is from an Urdu music treatise from the 1860s. And in that treatise, it depicts all of the different rags, the musical entities that are the basis of composition. And one of those rags is called Shri. And Shri in particular is considered a very courtly, magisterial musical entity, rag. And the illustrator chose Wajid Ali Shah as the embodiment of this rag. And so there he is surrounded by paris, so angel/fairy, depending on how you want to translate it, and demons. And at the top, it calls him Suleiman-e-Awadh, the Solomon of the kingdom of Awadh, his own kingdom. So on the one hand, the British were constantly writing about how Wajid Ali Shah liked to surround himself by finely draped women dressed as fairies, and they really looked down on this. But on the other hand, according to the Urdu Persianate imaginary, what he was doing was he was embodying the Prophet Solomon, who was given mastery over angels and demons, and was also the ultimate musical king. So really, he was tapping into an entire ideology and imaginary behind this, which other people recognize. This isn't his work. This is another musicologist who is creating this image based on Wajid Ali Shah, expecting his readers to get that connotation. But the British didn't get that connotation, and they didn't want to get it, which is why they pursued the idea that he was a decadent despot. And unfortunately, that message has really come through down to us today. And this convergence between morality, political strategy, and aesthetics helps to explain a related phenomenon, a reluctance to talk about all the varied innovations in art music that were being cultivated in this period. And what I mean is people often talk about how this was the beginning of classical music, and classical music as a category has its own very specific ideology behind it. But they don't really talk about how many innovative, creative, experimental forms were happening. So in particular, Wajid Ali Shah is always associated with Kathak dance and the Tumri genre. And these are two very established forms today. Beyond music, of course, people also talk about his contributions to biryani. So it's really these three, Kathak, Tumri, biryani. And what has more often been forgotten is how he worked across lots of different forms and genres. So in the book, I talk about how he composed lots of drupads, which, if you don't know, is a completely different genre and is considered highly esteemed and worlds apart from what we think Wajid Ali Shah would have done. But then at the same time, he also wrote musical slapstick, sometimes scatological sketch comedies, which are a little risque, but please do go through the book and find those. They're quite fun. He is also remembered as the great pioneer of the Tumri genre, but when I started working on this, I found that one of his wives, who I'll come to later, wrote far more Tumri lyrics than he did, and he celebrated that and published her works. But again, a lot of this has been forgotten, and in particular, when it comes to the contributions of women, because of this issue around the morality and the decadence of music, so much of women's music making in this period was occluded and not openly talked about. And so we need to find ways, and the book suggests a few, of trying to find the spaces for innovative and experimental art music, and especially the ones that were cultivated by women. And this gestures then to my final point about the rupture narrative. And that's about memory. Memory, of course, is not a cold and neutral record, but it's rather imbued with both emotions and strategies, which inform the ways in which the past is retold and curated. And when I worked on this book, I tried to bring together accounts of the 19th century as told by hereditary musicians, by essayists writing in Urdu and Bengali, by British colonial administrators, by song collectors and music teachers, and the descendants of the Nawab himself, who I was lucky to meet. The late 19th century was a crucial yet complicated time for all of these people, and examining the memory of music sheds light on the subtle ways individuals and communities articulated the way the world was changing around them. So, when I began the work of reconstructing the court in exile, I didn't find a moribund or broken court. Instead, I follow how the musicians, dancers, and intellectuals who came to Calcutta scattered across the city and beyond, evolving their repertoires and aesthetics as they traveled and navigated a changing political landscape. I tried to make sense of these movements through two approaches. So firstly, I ended up expanding the timeline of my study to view those musical movements as part of a much longer history. And this raised a whole set of issues, particularly around the impact of colonialism. Rather than focusing on key moments like 1856, 1857, the book talks about the rolling impact of larger social processes and changes stemming from the fracturing of the Mughal Empire in the 18th century and the rise of successor states like Lucknow, but also Murshidabad. And this longer-term perspective brought out the significance of multiple sites of music making, which really complicate the idea of a linear movement from court to court, from court to city, Lucknow to Kolkata. Patrons, musicians and dancers, poets and intellectuals, and styles and genres circulated across all of these spaces over the 19th century. So this is a very word-heavy slide. So I'm going to take you through it and give you a very speedy tour of the book, chapter by chapter, to show you how these spaces end up being connected. So I begin the book by talking about the social context for Hindustani music, North Indian music in Bengal over the 18th and early 19th centuries. And I talk about the prestige that North Indian musicians and styles enjoyed in Eastern India and the changing conditions of patronage around 1800. So chapter 1 considers the social history of Bengali court musicians, particularly in places like Murshidabad, Burdwan, and Bishnupur. And this was a restless period, of course, when the Mughal Empire was faltering and new regional powers, including, but not only the British, were rising to prominence. And musicians in this period began to turn their attention to new clients and patrons who adopted an older preference for North Indian art music. So I look at how Bengali musicians interacted with musicians from North India, and then I follow court musicians who then migrate from the provincial kingdoms into Kolkata. And this section, kind of in the 18th century, was particularly interesting because it's very different from how we think about regional musics today. In particular, when you're looking at Bengali music, people will instinctively now think about a particular Bengali style of gaan, of music. Rabindra Sangeet in particular, i.e. the music pioneered by Rabindranath Tagore, has really sort of dominated the way we think about Bengali culture. And of course, people like Andrew Sartori have written about the process there, and before, for an earlier period, Kumkum Chatterjee. What really stands out is, you know, how much Tagore was responding to a situation that was there in the 19th century, one which really privileged and prized not Bengali music, but music from outside of Bengal, music that had traveled from North India. And what's very apparent is how patrons and musicians were constantly looking westwards to places like Lucknow and Delhi and thinking, what is the art music there and how can we embed it in a cosmopolitan way in Bengal? It's such a different cultural imaginary to what we have now in the kind of post-Tagore universe. So I follow that story a little in chapter 2, where I reconstruct networks of music enthusiasts who came together from mixed, socially unfixed backgrounds. So I talk about Mughal poets, exiled princes, Bengali merchants, and American travelers who all ended up listening to art music in Kolkata, often together. So the chapter follows how musicians from Bengali courts began to make connections in the city, entering a soundscape shaped by street performances and salon recitals, where music was an integral part of a nascent Bengali urban imaginary. And then having set that up and talking about the larger kind of transregional themes in the 19th century, I jump over to Lucknow to see what Wajid Ali Shah was doing before he was exiled. I draw on a range of English newspapers and government archives to examine how Wajid Ali Shah came to be seen as that notorious figure, the epitome, the embodiment of the Oriental despot, as I've already mentioned. There were so many portrayals, particularly in English language newspapers, but so many portrayals of the king as this decadent aesthete. And they all talk about his sensuality, his obscene body, and the corrupt musicians he kept as his intimate companions. And of course, all of this was galvanized as an excuse for British intervention. So having deconstructed those British accounts, I examine his own writings in Persian and Urdu, particularly the Ishqnama, the Book of Love, his erotic memoir. And I consider how he understood the appreciation of music in terms of the Solomonic ideal that I mentioned earlier, and the political virtues of mastering the emotions and exploring the affective self through music and indeed his aesthetic preference for the fantastical. So again, often the British accounts aren't always wrong in what they are describing and what they're saying is happening. There were women dressed as fairies. He was putting on musical entertainments that were extremely lavish, but the ideology and the way of interpreting those things were really, really very different. So then in chapter 4, I look at the exile period. The court at Matiyaburj was effectively demolished after his death in the 1880s. Most of it was auctioned off and subsequently destroyed. There are a few remaining buildings left, but we can reconstruct an awful lot of material. And before me, Rosie Llewellyn-Jones wrote an entire book about this period as well. And so she did amazing work piecing it all together. So I looked at this court from a range of perspectives, from the views of English government agents, Bengali diarists, Urdu journalists, and I look at how court musicians navigated extreme political changes in the king's liminal and ephemeral music rooms. In particular, I look at how the king's innovative contributions to art music, especially through his own song collections and music treatises, and I argue that the musicians, dancers, and choreographers in this court developed innovative styles and original forms. And this really challenges that popular memory of the court as a monument to a dying Mughal world by stressing instead the modernity and the creativity of the musical king and the performing artists who were with him. And at this stage, I look into the musical contributions of his first and most senior wife, Khas Mahal. Khas Mahal was largely forgotten in later accounts of this period, but in her own time, she was a vocal and highly creative figure in this court. She wrote volumes of poetry. She worked with the king on song lyrics and his musical theatre projects. So I look at her creative outputs, and I consider the life of music in the women's quarters of royal courts, where women like Khas Mahal lived behind purdah. And drawing on a rich legal archive, I also look at how the Queen eventually emancipated herself from Wajid Ali Shah, achieved financial independence, and built her own household in Calcutta, where she could listen to music on her own terms. The chapter also gets it also goes down a path of gossip and scandal, because I look at how she comes under the influence of one of her relatives called Pyari Sahib, who appears here. Pyari Sahib is particularly interesting because he later on became one of India's first and leading gramophone celebrity recording artists. He was particularly famous because, well, for two reasons. One, He was doing gramophone recording before most men were. Most men were very reluctant to do it, and courtesan singers were the first to really break into that industry. So that was unusual. He was a man before most men were doing it, but also he sang like a woman. And so when you listen to him, he really sounds like a middle-aged courtesan, and it really stands out. There are recordings of him on YouTube, so go look for Pyare Sahib, and it's quite interesting. But my book is the first to document his connections to Qas Mahal and Wajid Ali Shah. And in particular, I talk about how he acquired these so-called feminine styles of singing, these feminine repertoires, by sitting in Qas Mahal's house, where she had music going 6 nights a week. He also, as I show, had relationships with a lot of the musicians in her court, a lot of the singers and so on. And so he really absorbed that entire repertoire by sitting with her. So this is intriguing because it really challenges our understanding of women's involvement in the life of music in colonial India. And it also demonstrates how the private music making of courts actually became entangled with public commercialized recording industries. And then finally, I look at how musicians who had originally arrived in Calcutta with this court began to fan out across the city, looking for patrons among the Bengali urban intelligentsia, and how they injected the city with Hindustani music and their expertise. So this is partly about providing a history of court musicians as they stepped outside of courtly patronage. And so I'm looking at the 1860s to 1890s here. But I also look at some of the new reformist movements that, like I said at the beginning, were trying to reject this entire world. And in particular, a lot of the reform movements in music in Kolkata were figureheaded by members of the Bengali Hindu Bhadralok community, kind of genteel community. What's interesting, though, is how, perhaps surprisingly, a lot of the hereditary Muslim professional musicians who were attached to the court became deeply entangled in these Hindu modernizing projects, and were often teaching these so-called self-proclaimed custodians of classical music. So there is a bit of a paradox here, because on the one hand, we have the writings of these music reformers saying these illiterate ustads and music masters have ruined music, and we need to fight to preserve and save a Hindu art music. And we've taken them at their word because they've written about it so extensively. But then they're also sitting with these ustads, they're giving them medals, and they're also sometimes taking them on as their own gurus. So actually the reality is really, really complicated, and there are contradictions and paradoxes in this society. So while other histories of this time have looked at these modern reformist initiatives, I look at these schools and societies relative to all those other spaces. And I argue that in particular, music lovers' homes, not the schools and societies, but the homes, became really significant sites for musicians, and more so than ticketed concerts or the theatre stages that we're so obsessed with. I developed the idea of a networked sphere, one where musical households provided spaces for musicians, their disciples, and their patrons, which were not wholly private, but also required personal introductions through their participants. So if we zoom out again to this word-heavy image, we can see how music does not travel by itself, like a disembodied ghost, nor is it tied to a single larger-than-life personality like Wajid Ali Shah. The book keeps the king at its center, but the concept of a scattered court reminds us that North Indian art music has a layered, entangled social history shaped by patrons, artists, and scholars who are attempting to navigate a shifting political landscape. So I won't go on for too much longer, but I thought I'd finish with, I tried to bring this together through a particular case study and kind of show how we can do a deep reading of a musical source. I'm not going to sing, don't worry. But traditionally in North Indian classical music in a concert, you would finish with a tumri. So a tumri, like I said, is that genre that is associated most with Wajid Ali Shah. That was the style of singing that appeared in the film clip I showed you. And it's often used at the end of a concert, sort of like a dessert course. So I thought we would look at one of those. So normally, tumri, which is usually composed in classical Hindi, is primarily about love and the exploits of Krishna. But you can also have a tradition of woeful, weeping tumri, and one that talks about the themes of longing, of loss, of distance. And often that idea of a lamentful tumri is associated with Lucknow and is associated foremost with Wajid Ali Shah. So, this is quite an intriguing example. So let's have a quick look at the text itself, since it's very short. For those of you who can read Bengali, at the bottom it's called a Lucknow Tumri, but this is appearing in a Bengali book, a Bengali songbook, in the Bengali script. So how might one read it? Nimok harami mein molok dubaya, hajrat jawe London ko, mahal mahal mein begum roye, galiana gali mein roye ataria. So the kingdom is drowned in the salt of the harem. His Majesty is going to London. In every palace, his ladies are weeping. Come to the alley. In the alley, the cobbles weep. So linguistically, it's quite interesting, particularly because it's meant to be from Lucknow. It's meant to be about that moment of Wajid Ali Shah going into exile. It's got quite a lot of Urdu in there, rather than the classical Hindi that you would normally associate with tumri. But also this is a Bengali sort of interpretation of it as well. And so there's a sort of interaction between, we could say, classical Hindi, Hindustani, and Bengali happening here. This was edited in 1870. So this is exactly the time when Wajid Ali Shah is in Calcutta. And therefore, the emotional disturbance from 1856, from 1857, is still very keenly felt, and it has been distilled and bottled in this song lyric. Weeping, the idea of weeping has, particularly Lucknow style weeping, has very strong connotations with Wajid Ali Shah. He fashioned himself as an authentic ascete. He's constantly crying. Yeah, but when I was going through the archives, on the one hand, when he writes about himself, he's constantly weeping. He wrote this book, Huzn-e-Akhtar, Grief of the Star, Star being his pen name. And again, in his poetry, there's a lot of weeping. In his devotional practices as a Shia Muslim, he wrote lots of marsiyas, so did lots of weeping in that ritualized context. And we also hear about his weeping a lot from British sources, who the British agents were continually exhausted by how much he was weeping in front of them. But for him, it was very much part of a larger aesthetic practice. He really saw himself as the ultimate lover of Urdu poetry. He was a living ghazal as far as he was concerned. When his first marriage was delayed through nobody's fault, it was delayed, he refused to remove his wedding clothes for 2 months in sort of protest to really express his feelings about it. And the most famous, well-known example of his weeping is another Tumri lyric that's attributed to him, Babala Mora. This one's very, very famous. And again, here he adopts the persona of a weeping bride being taken out of her family home on her wedding day, moving on to her husband's house. So the singer says, "Father, my maternal home is being left behind. 4 water carriers together lift up my palanquin. What's mine, what's not, it's all being left behind." This is very, very popular. If you haven't heard versions of Babala Mora, please go onto YouTube or whatever and find some. Kishoya Munka's version is actually beautiful. But again, people look at this and talk about how, on the one hand, it's the bride, on the other hand, it's the human spirit in the moment of death, being carried not in a palanquin, but rather a funeral pyre. And then they will also talk about him leaving Lucknow, being carried out in his palanquin, weeping as he left Lucknow. I think this is the most common version. I'm not convinced he actually wrote this song, to be honest. So I think this might be popular memory jumping in. So the British saw his emotional anguish as a form of melodrama, a symptom of his mental state, a political proof that he was unfit to be king. But his weeping can also be read as a rich engagement with aesthetics, with feeling, and his attempt to embody a poetic theory. That really comes through in his own writings, which are clearly informed by the imaginary that you also see in other works of musicology. For example, in the Ishqnama, his erotic memoir, when he talks about his mastery of the sitar, he says the attendants of his gatherings, his music parties, the mehfils, were astonished. I made people cry as they laughed and laugh as they cried. And there's another beautiful moment where he hides behind a curtain and plays the sitar and confuses everyone's emotions. So for him, emotional play and techniques were something that he was exploring scientifically through music. This Lucknowi, Lucknow style understanding of weeping and crying entered Bengali music, as seen in that Tumri lyric, but it also comes through, interestingly, in Bengali memoirs about when Bengali musicians met these ustads, when they met the master musicians from Lucknow and Delhi. I'll give you just a couple of examples. So in the book, I talk about one of these musicians from Lucknow, Murad Ali Khan, who had a disciple, a Bengali disciple, Kishori Lal Mukhopadhyay. Kishori Lal was a lawyer, and then he was ill and he couldn't practice law anymore, so he took up music, and he took on Murad Ali Khan as his guru. And there's a whole description about how they would start preparing meat for Murad Ali Khan because he was the guru and anything he touched was pure, etc. We know quite a bit about Murad Ali Khan from Kishori Lal's two sons. One of his sons was a revolutionary and was imprisoned. So his second son, Dan Gopal, escaped India because he was afraid that he would also be imprisoned for revolutionary activities. And he ended up going to the USA, where he became a really famous children's author. And in his books, he talks about Murad Ali Khan. So he describes this musician's singers. He says his tones were deep and vibrant as a bullfrog's. And he says he had a terrific way of opening his mouth when he sang, and we used to tell him that he almost swallowed the universe. And there are these beautiful passages in here where, again, he's writing primarily for children, this book not so much, but again, he has this beautiful way of capturing the experience of the child living with this old weeping ustad. Some of the passages are very sad. So he says that Murad Ali Khan composed a song which is known as the Remorse Song. O my king, for your sake I go as a mendicant of song from door to door, but desolation greets me as a great shadow on either hand. The glories are gone, and wild animals prowl through the palaces, but the wild animals that prowl through my heart, who can take them away? And then he says, you can hear this song now in India. It is a terrible cry of anguish. I've not heard this before, but I'm sure there were forms of it in circulation. He wasn't alone in talking about this. We also get quite a lot of Bengalis writing about another musician called Natu Khan, who would perform in Bengali households. And when Bengali singers would listen to him, including Agorinath Chakrabarti, they would weep with him, and they would understand the pain which he was expressing and weep in their own performances. So there was one particular anecdote where the Bengali patron of this music party turns to Natu Khan and says, "Vah, you are such a wonderful ustad. How can I honor you for this fantastic performance?" And he replies, "I did not come for honor. Music is my livelihood. I came for money. What honor would you give me? I used to sit before the Emperor of Delhi. The vizier himself used to place the hookah pipe into my hand. Is there any honor after that? And again, then it talks about how Agorinath Chakrabarti cries when he hears all this. So read collectively, these portraits of musicians indicate how Bengali elites who listened and then studied with Hindustani ustads, often bringing them into their families, began to reflect on this cultural transition, the cultural transition these musicians had lived through. The musician who wept at the name of the king or the emperor became a recurring image. And the relationship between the musician and the lost world of the Hindustani court was crucial. And this can be seen, of course, as a literary expression of the Bengali fascination with exalted art music, which they saw as stemming from the ancient regime of the Mughal Empire. Evoking nostalgia and mourning made it possible for the Bengali writer to fashion himself as the inheritor and the custodian of the Mughal legacy by appropriating the musical repertoire, but also the feelings of the Hindustani ustad. So just to wrap up, Wajid Ali Shah, like I say, is a household name in India today, but he has a highly mixed legacy. While he persists in popular memory as a musical genius, he's simultaneously condemned as a political failure. And while these two storylines are repeated across textbooks, films, and novels, his own contributions to musical thought and practice and the stories of the musicians around him have often been neglected or forgotten. So in The Scattered Court, I try to demonstrate how these two storylines, artiste and despot, are actually really entangled, and how their partiality has limited the ways in which we think about the history of Hindustani music. His connected courts gesture to a longer history of trans-regional conversations about music and a shared appreciation for music in both emotional and political life. When Bengali music lovers wept over songs from Lucknow at the end of the 19th century, their tears can be traced back to the stylings of Wajid Ali Shah, but also to a longer history of Bengali engagement with the sounds and art music of Mughal North India. Against that entangled history, colonialism emerges as a driving force behind certain pressures and priorities, but also as one consideration among many others that emerged in Bengali, Persian, Urdu, and Hindi sources at that time. So the Scattered Court challenges the existing history of Hindustani music and Indian culture under colonialism by arguing that our focus on English language sources and modernizing impulses has really directed us away from the aesthetic subtleties, the historical continuities, and emotional dimensions of 19th century music. I'll finish there. Thank you very much. Do we have some questions?
I just wanted to text questions.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so like my question, like I'm reading a book right now. It's called Sangeet Loknaट्य, wherein there is a reference to one British
Yeah.
and how it incorporated elements of musical genre. So have you come across any? So likewise, have you come across any manuscripts available in the talk about promoted musical?
Yes, yes. There's quite a lot on this. There's a PhD study which I will direct you to because you're like that a lot. I mean, what comes through is, yeah. So again, part of the challenge of the fascination with classical music as a category means that it has been distanced from all other kinds of music, including Lokgeet or Loknath, etc. Anything folky, basically, or popular. And this isn't really what you see in the sources for this period. So with Wajid Ali Shah, he was very interested in kind of street music and street performance. So one of the things that he did was he took the songs of people who would be working in the city, water carriers, etc., and write musical theatre pieces around them. Often he and his wife would compose the lyrics that they would imagine the water carrier, etc., or the sweeper would be performing. And so it's a sort of courtly kind of fascination with working class street culture that he absorbs. I mean, the other thing is that's absorbed across languages. So he primarily wrote in Urdu and Persian. He knew classical Hindi, but in Bengal, he also brings in a sort of his take on Bengali language in these song lyrics as well. In terms of his musical theatre, so he's got quite a few different styles that he pioneered. And the history is actually a bit complicated. He starts off doing that work in Lucknow with his wife, Taj Mahal. And when he's doing it, he's drawing on lots of different elements, including Rath Leela, of course, but also what's happening in the same period with the origins of Urdu theatre, Inter Sabha, and so on. He's picking up a lot of different influences. And in particular, the PhD thesis that I'll send you talks about the surprising links between kind of what we would now consider the folk culture of Vrindavan, Matiyaburj region, and how that actually ties up with the musical theatre that you get in Lucknow. So there are all of these connections which completely break down the boundary of this is classical, this is folk, this is, you know, Shastriya Sangeet, and this is Loki. Yeah. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
Is there any Indian or even they didn't know music, and they just
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. You get a really varied and sometimes contradictory picture with this. So basically a lot of, well, there are lots of different angles on you know, what is actually decadent about music in the first place. There's an older line which Catherine Schofield's written about, an older line of thought that you get even in the Mughal period, in Persian sources, which is saying you can like music, but don't get carried away. And if you do, then you're probably going to lose your kingdom. And so there's a whole sort of etiquette and kind of guidance for princes type literature saying don't get carried away, and in particular, don't spend too much time with courtesans, etc. So that older idea of overindulgence in music was there. In the 19th century, you also, it's an interesting period because in North India, a lot of it's only in the 19th century that you really get amateur musicians performing on instruments themselves, rather than being the patron who pays for a musician to do it. So again, this image on the cover of him playing the sitar is quite striking, and you wouldn't really have had that a couple of generations before, or even a generation before. And it was quite controversial in certain circles of Indian society for a king to be playing instruments, because instrument playing is what, you know, lower class or lower caste communities would be doing. So it was quite outrageous when there are images of him playing the drum in Shatranj Ke Khilari. There's a scene at the beginning where he's drumming in a Maharam procession, and all of that was actually quite controversial. In the newspapers at the time, you get a real debate about it. So sometimes people are saying, well, they're saying all kinds of things. At one point, the Nawab of Rampur goes to a ball, English-style ball, and he's doing some ballroom dancing. And this really raises a lot of questions. And people are saying, should an Indian king be dancing in public, or is that just completely unthinkable and unacceptable? So that debate is happening. In the end, it gets resolved because they say, well, I mean, Krishna danced, and so it's probably okay. But, you know, so people are really grappling with different ways of making sense of it. Yeah, it's a very mixed view, and a lot of it depends on the class of the performer. Some people are saying, oh, it's a kind of urban thing that urban playboy elites are doing, but it's not really what refined moral people should be doing. And then for women, of course, it's a much bigger conversation, because it's really in this period that first of all, professional performing women such as courtesans are hugely stigmatized, marginalized, pushed out of public space. And then the fear of having women in quote unquote respectable families being considered immoral, decadent because of their musical activities, that became a real pressing concern for a lot of people. You get newspaper editorials saying, oh, it's terrible during wedding season because you walk past family homes and you hear the disgusting things that women are singing in their lyrics as part of the wedding festivities, and we need to put a stop to this. So there is a real campaign to try to quieten down, or at least hide, the music that women are performing. So all of that's happening in this period as well. It's Indian, but of course it's infused with the Victorian sensibilities that are coming through at the same time through education. So that's why it's a real mishmash of different things. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And yes, exactly. And in some ways, it's an idea that's shared across cultures. The idea that if you treat music as a science, which you are studying intellectually but not getting too involved in, it's okay. If you roll up your sleeves and start performing music and go to music parties all the time, then it's not. But part of what I look at in the book is I try to make sense of, you know, where the British were coming from when they presented these views and projected them in India, because, you know, those views have their own history, of course, as well. So there's a very nice study by Matthew Head, who talks about changing attitudes to the place of music in society in 18th and 19th century Britain. And anyway, it's a while since I've read it, but it's the larger concept is about, you know, if you're in the 17th century in Britain, of course kings listen to music. Of course there's loads of music in courts, etc. 18th century as well, early 18th century, it's still seen as part and parcel of political life, political culture, the culture of elites. That changes in Britain through into the 19th century. And so by the time you get British administrators talking to Wajid Ali Shah, they've inherited that idea that no, playtime is over for rulers. If you're a ruler, you go to your desk and you do your paperwork, etc. So, I mean, I'm generalizing a bit, but again, there are these ideas. And Matthew Head argues that a lot of this is also about the public imaginary of gender and the idea of feminine virtues and masculine virtues that take shape in the 18th century. So again, this explains why when they see Wajid Ali Shah playing music all the time, they're saying he's so effeminate. He's always listening to music. So again, they kind of inherited that language and projected it.
Did he absorb any European? I know he composed on the road.
Not that I can see, very little, very little. He did have, so he had, as most rulers did, he did have a European style band, which would be used for processions and things and so on. But no, he didn't really seem to engage with Western music. And I think, I mean, so and it makes sense in a way. On the Lucknow side, when he was still there, Rosie Llewellyn-Jones talks about it was really him and his father who just start distancing themselves from British culture compared to earlier Nawabs who were really embracing it. And because the politics had changed so much. And then when he's in Calcutta, he had quite limited interactions with the British. And to the extent that the British thought he was a complete recluse and had cut himself off from everyone and wouldn't see anyone. And that's not true. He saw plenty of Indians. And they all write about it in Bengali and Urdu, but in English, it's as though he's this shadowy figure behind a curtain. So no, he didn't really embrace Western music very much. Yeah.
Got very far. I think in the Bishop report.
Yeah.
I think I'm right in saying that the tournament was one of the semi-diary by far the biggest. The family had come to go. Did they put any of their huge resources?
I think that's in the book as well. I think I do feature, I feature Burdwan as one of the, so keep reading. But no, thank you. No, it does come up. Yeah, exactly. But, and actually what's interesting, sorry, it's been a while since I went through that section. So with Burdwan, it's interesting because they really follow the model I set out here of Bengali rulers wanting to be taken seriously as rulers, and so they import ustads from northern India. And in Burdwan, you get you get a whole set of interesting stories where there is one Bengali musician there who is of the same level as these northern ustads. And he's considered this real exception to the rule. And I think with Burdwan, I include an anecdote that comes up a bit later, but it's an anecdote about a celebrity courtesan from northern India who is traveling all around Bengal by boat. And when she gets to Burdwan, she performs and she suspects that no one will appreciate her music and no one really understands what she's doing. So she breaks the rule of a rag just to, see if anyone notices. And this one Bengali musician raises because he identified. And he doesn't say anything, but he's like, And so, there's this whole passage. And I got this from a Bengali text, which talks about the great musical stars of the past, etc. And they say, that shows that he alone was the great pioneer. So it's interesting. It's very interesting, this moment in the 18th century, which again is so different from what you get later, where people are really talking about Bengali expertise and Bengali musicality and so on. It's a very different way of thinking about it. Please.
I want to ask you about this position. Very slightly after, born in 19th, so it's after the death of. But he did same thing, created dance.
Yes.
Heavily influenced dance to or we now think of West is Indian dance. But everything that you said, I think throughout his whole life, starting from really early 19th, very close. I wanted it in looking at the legacy of you encountered, because he was very connected with the four brothers, everybody knew everybody.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful question. No, I didn't look into that actually. It's very interesting. I mean, how interesting. Yeah, I haven't heard that comparison made between him and Vajid, but you're right, because again, they're both, neither of them are keeping to a conventional repertoire. They are developing repertoire that later became the model, etc. They're coming at it from slightly different sources. I mean, with Wajid Ali Shah, he was part of a conversation that's happening among choreographers and musicologists writing in Urdu. There's a sequence of music treatises that are developing the dance steps, the guts, that later get incorporated into Kathak dance. And so he's part of that conversation that's happening with Muslim intellectuals and dancers. And then with Uday Shankar, I mean, what's interesting, of course, is a lot of his repertoire, as was developed on the road in a way, and really developed thinking, what can we actually do and stage in Europe? And this is why he trains the people around him in music and says, there's a sort of more improvised working with the resources they had approach, which is very different from Wajid Ali Shah, because he had all the resources he could need. He had, and the book talks about this, he had an army of music instructors, dance instructors with him, who were all sort of cultivating this styles, plural, actually.
Yeah, and there's that bringing together different traditions we're talking, or we don't have to think Indian art.
Yeah.
That literally taken from as well as in Yoga.
Yeah. It's such an interesting story, isn't it?
But she sent him back to India to produce his own tradition, but getting that same way. True to but totally new at the same time, just like this. People love it.
And it's similar as well in the sense that these are Bengali musicians and dancers who at a certain stage say, actually, we do need to bring in a Khansab, we need to bring in an Ustad to get the musical training in, right? And so this is how Ravi Shankar takes off, right? After he gets the Ustad training. Because before then he was trying to figure it out because his brother said, quickly go play something, you know? And so it's so very similar to this paradigm, you know, the Bengali amateur becomes professional and needs to bring in a Ustad to do it, to get the help. Yeah, thank you. What a lovely comparison.
Thank you.
First, something that came in the talk and in the question, whole idea of the feminine musician king and how it was used against or to create certain images. Did it ever come in those writings that Britain is ruled by a woman with fondness to music, Mendelssohn early on in Spain, or was it kind of treated as a completely different set of rules for us and for them?
That's a really, interesting. No, basically, they don't really make that point. And again, I think it's partly, why is it? I think it's I think the British agent, for example, if he were here, he would have argued that it's completely different. A, because there were prejudices about what kind of music it was, obviously. Secondly, Queen Victoria wasn't playing an instrument all the time. I mean, with his court, there are the descriptions from the Bengalis who went in where there was just a wash of music at all time. And, you know, people could just sort of suddenly start up playing something because there was a drone the whole time, etc. So that was part of the overindulgence model that they talked about. But again, you know, from a kind of courtly studies, South Asian courtly perspective, that makes perfect sense. It's fine. It's no different from, you know, Emma Flack's work on perfumes, where she talks about the descriptions where people would walk in and there were just petals everywhere because you needed to, on the floor, you'd be walking through all of these petals because you wanted this saturated sensorium. So it makes sense to have drones in the background, but no, the British weren't keen. And then, of course, the second thing was he was very deeply personally connected to musicians. His best friends were musicians. And this was the bit that was troubling for a lot of people. Yeah. But yeah, no, it's not a hard and fast rule. I mean, when I was talking about the newspapers and saying should the Nawab of Rampur be dancing, etc., you can really see that if a Nawab is in political favor, if a Nawab is not in political favor, it's a decadent, awful, terrible thing, and he should not be doing the waltz. You know, it's really, yeah, it's often used as an excuse more. Oh, did you have? Okay.
I think we will finish there. Thank you very, very much indeed. If you have any more questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.